What is happening, everyone? Welcome back to episode 34 of Manny's Food Channel. It's your boy Manny, and I hope everyone had a great start to the new year so far. For today's episode, I'm going to be making a dish that I've made plenty of times. It's one of those dishes that I thoroughly enjoy, and I would probably put it on my list as one of my all-time favorites. I've cooked it over and over again, so I hope that I'm close to near perfection on this dish, but I can always make some more tweaks. For today's episode, I'm going to be making a Persian dish, and this is called Tahchin. And basically what that is in a loose translation called molded rice. So it's layered with different kinds of ingredients. We create a stock and then eventually turn it into a broth that we infuse that flavor into the rice, along with some barberries, some chicken, and some onions as well. So without further ado, let's get to it. Now, I don't usually say that the first step in any recipe is the most important, but for this specific recipe here, this step right here is going to be the most important because we want to be able to extract the maximum amount of flavor from the onions and the sweetness as well. That's really what we're going for. And it's interesting how one ingredient cooked different ways can kind of change or enhance or decrease the flavor. But in this case here, we're going to cook the onions in butter. If you have salted, you don't need to season it. If you have unsalted, then I would season it later on through the cooking process. But we're going to cook the onions in butter on medium to low heat, making sure that we do not brown the onions at any stage of the cooking process. If we do that, it will change the color of the broth, it will change the flavor of the onions, and we don't want to do that. So first, I'm going to melt off the butter in my pan here. Now once your butter is completely melted, and you start to see that it's simmering just a touch, now we're going to throw in our onions. Again, I can't stress this enough. You want to make sure that you just wilt your onions completely, and you don't want to add any sort of color to the onions to kind of change the texture and integrity of the onion. And by doing so, when we wilt it this way, we really bring out the nice sweet and deliciousness that comes from the onions. So in this recipe, I love to add a lot of onions because when we're eating it, you want to have a nice garnish inside. You don't want to have just a little bit, you want to have a lot of it, and a lot of that ingredients kind of going through this molded rice. So here I have about 7 to 8 onions. If you like more onions, by all means add in some more. If you don't like onions too much, you're definitely missing out. So I'm going to toss in these onions. This part here of the cooking process is going to be the longest. I'm going to be cooking it for around 15 to 20 minutes on medium to low heat. I'm going to add a cover on top and making sure that I stir it once every 3 to 4 minutes, so that way it doesn't stick to the bottom, and also we don't change the color or burn the onions. So once your onions are completely wilted and it's got that transparent or translucent kind of look and feel to it, now we're going to add in the chicken. And I seasoned the skin side with a little bit of salt and pepper, and I'm going to place it skin side down, so that way we render off some of that fat to add more flavor to the broth as we're cooking it. And once I add in all the chicken, I'm going to season the other side of the chicken as well with some more salt and pepper. And we're going to cook this off for probably around 5 minutes or so, just until we melt off a touch of that fat. So once you've rendered off some of the fat from the skin, now we're going to add in the rest of the ingredients. I'm going to start off by pouring just enough chicken stock. This is unsalted that I bought from the store, and I'm going to put enough just to go a little bit more than covering all of the chicken. So here I have close to a liter. Next up, I'm going to add in the saffron. This is going to be one of the main ingredients to add that flavor and depth of flavor we're looking for. I don't typically like to grind it in a pestle and mortar. I like to do it by hand. But if you're going to do it by hand, make sure your hands are dry, so that way that flavor and the coloring doesn't stick to your hand and you want it inside the dish. So we're gonna quickly crush up some saffron. And next, a lot of chefs like to say that you shouldn't season the broth as it's cooking because it's gonna reduce and it's gonna intensify kind of that saltiness, and the end result could possibly be salty. But I'm gonna show you a little bit later, once this is cooked, as to why we want it a little bit more over seasoned than usual. So now, I am gonna season it. I'm not gonna season it completely like it normally would because again, it will reduce. But I'm gonna add a touch of salt, and I'm gonna add some black pepper. And we're going to cover this up and let it cook on the stove for about an hour or so. Let it braise nicely on medium to low heat, so that the chicken can become completely tender. And in the meantime, we'll move on to preparing the basmati rice for the molded tahchin. Okay, so while the chicken is braising, we're gonna cook off the basmati rice. Now, the only rice that I would recommend you buying is either Persian rice or Indian rice. Now, the reason for that is when we're cooking it, it's very hard to kind of destroy the integrity of the rice. And when we cook this kind of rice or any kind of Middle Eastern rice, you want the grains to be separated after it's cooked. So sometimes when you go to the grocery store and you buy basmati rice, and after you cook it, it becomes a bit mushy and they stick together. That's not the kind of integrity that you want. So make sure you either buy Persian basmati rice or Indian. And this one here, I rinse it about 10 to 15 times to make sure I removed all the dust or any dirt that's within the rice. And just before I toss the rice in the boiling water, I'm going to make the water ocean salty. So ocean salty pretty much means you're going to over salt the water. And we're going to give this a quick mix. The reason why we make it ocean salty is because not all of that salt is going to stick to the rice. Once we rinse it after it's almost cooked, it kind of removes some of the salt. So we just want to season it just enough so that the rice is a little bit seasoned. So now I'm going to toss in the basmati rice, and I'm going to let this come back to a boil and cook it off for around 7 to 9 minutes. Now, it really depends on what kind of rice you have at home. I'm going to cook this just to the point of it being al dente or firm to the bite. We're not going to overcook it or fully cook it because we're going to be baking the rice the rest of the way. So you don't want to have mushy, overcooked rice. And once you put the rice in here, set a timer, 7 to 9 minutes. Or if you've cooked basmati rice before, then you know around the 7-minute mark, just to come by and take a look, break a grain of rice to see whether or not it's cooked. And if it is, then you can strain it off, run it under cold water, and set it aside until it's ready to go. But while this rice is cooking, and just before I forget, make sure you stir it once in a while. That way the rice doesn't stick to the bottom of the pot as well. So while this is cooking here, I've just cut up some eggplant, and I've just added salt and pepper to it. Nothing crazy, a little bit of oil, and I'm going to roast it while the rice is cooking in the oven at 400 degrees for around 20 minutes or so. And once everything is complete, then we can start to build the tahchin. Okay, so now that the chicken is ready, it's completely braised and the chicken's extremely soft, I'm going to show you a couple of my techniques that I like to use. Now, first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate the onions and the chicken from the broth. And you're going to see in a second here why I mentioned earlier that the broth should be a little bit more over seasoned than you normally would. If you're going to use this broth right away, you're going to need a way to cool it down. But if you're not, then you can just leave it in the fridge and it will completely cool. You can use it the next day or whenever it is that you want to, or you're ready to use this ingredients here. So I'm going to quickly just clear this out. Now, I'm separating the onions and chicken from the broth. I'm just going to quickly make sure that all the broth is separate here. So now I'm going to set this aside. I'm not going to work on it right now. However, I am going to remove the chicken and shred them off from the bone. So I'm going to set this aside quickly. Now, if you want this to cool off right away, you're going to need a way to cool it off. Leaving it in the fridge won't enhance the time or quicken up the process for you to do so. So what I like to do is over-season the broth, one of two reasons. One, to make sure that the chicken and the onions that we had in here is seasoned extremely nicely. Two, I like to add ice. Ice will cool off the broth extremely quickly, so that way when we put together all the ingredients, we're not going to add it into the rice and cook the rice before it needs to be. So add in a bunch of ice in here to cool off the broth, and have a taste once the ice has completely melted. If you feel you need to season it up one more time, then season it up. Otherwise, there's one more ingredient that I'm going to add in here. And finally, I'm going to add just a touch of lemon juice. What the lemon juice is going to do is it's going to cut down a bit of that richness and balance out the flavor of the dish. You don't want to add too much because you don't want to taste or have that heavy flavor of lemon in there. So now I'm going to set this aside and let this cool down. In the meantime, I'm going to shred up the chicken, and we're going to come back and I'm going to show you how we're going to put this all together. Alright, so everything is prepared. We're ready to put together the tahchin. So first, in this bowl, I have 2 eggs. This is going to help to bind that molded aspect of the rice that holds the shape together. So here I have a little bit of eggs that I just whisked up. Now I'm going to add some yogurt. This is going to help to lighten up that part of the tahchin. So I'm just going to add some yogurt in here. Give this a nice mix. Once the egg is mixed in with the yogurt, now we're going to add in a little bit of the broth. You don't want to add too much. I'm adding half part of the broth, half of the fat, and that's another reason why we cooled off the broth right away. So now I'm going to give this a mix, but just to add a bit of color and differentiate between the top and the bottom of the molded rice, I have a bit of saffron water here. It's not pure saffron, however it does add a nice color to this dish. So I just added a touch of saffron water, and we're going to give this a really nice mix. Now, because earlier we heavily seasoned the broth, you don't need to add salt here. However, if you feel that you do need to add some salt, season it up. This will be the time to season anything that you need to, otherwise you can't season it after, of course. Next, we're going to add in the rice. Okay, now I'm going to add in around half of the rice that I cooked into this mix, but I won't add it all at once. I'm going to slowly incorporate all that rice to make sure that every grain has and is fully covered with that egg yolk and yogurt mix. So you start to notice it completely changes the color, adds a nice dimension to the dish, and once you've thoroughly mixed in all that rice, then you add in another handful. And I think after this handful for me here should be good enough. So give it a really nice mix. Again, make sure it's seasoned the way you like it to, because once it's cooked, of course, or you've completely assembled this dish, you can't season it after. So once this is ready, you're going to set this aside, and I'm going to show you the different kinds of techniques or molds that I use for this dish here. Alright, so now I'm going to show you how to assemble everything. These are individual portions. I'm going to also show you how I do family style. Now ultimately with a family style one, because I'm going to be using a glass baking sheet like this here, we're going to be putting a pan on top and then flipping it over. However, with these ones, I can either do that or I can just open them up, because technically they're made for cheesecakes. But either way works. So first, I'm going to grab some butter and brush the sides of the mold. That will help so to not let the rice stick to the side when we want to unmold the tahchin. So quickly add in and brush up some butter on each side. Doesn't matter whether or not it's salted or unsalted, but just make sure you cover all the surfaces. That way you have a nicely shaped molded rice in the end. So now that this is complete, we're going to start off with our first step. Now this is one of those things that you want to make sure that you use your hands. It is going to get a little bit messy, but you can work quickly that way. So first, we're going to add the molded portion of the rice at the very bottom. Make sure you add a nice amount and evenly distribute it amongst any kind of mold that you're using. Next, we're going to add in some barberries. This is very popular in Iran. You can get this at any Middle Eastern grocery store. And it's a kind of berry. It's similar to sour cherries. It's more on the tart side. Usually we use this to kind of cut down the richness of the dish. So for a big pack of, I think 500 grams doesn't cost more than $7 to $8, $7 or $8. But evenly distribute this barberries among each of the bowl. I really enjoy barberries, so I tend to add a lot more in it. But if you find that you don't like it too sour, then maybe you can cut back on the barberries just a touch. And then next up, we're going to add a little bit of our eggplant. Just make sure you kind of cover most surface area of the molded rice, so that way in every bite you can kind of have a bit of that eggplant flavor in there. And because we roasted it, it's got a nice smoky flavor in there. And then finally, we're going to add in the chicken and the onion mix. I removed it from the bone and I mixed it back in with the onions. And that was one of the reasons why I did that, so that way we can just control the portion or the amount of onions or meat that we're adding to it. So now I'm going to add some of this chicken and onions. Alright, so just before I cover it up, I'm going to add a touch more broth. Now, ideally, the reason why I make a lot of broth is because I also like to serve it with that broth as well. There's such a intense depth of flavor in the broth that you want to make sure you share it with your guests and your friends and family, right? All that delicious flavor. So, once I've added all that broth, now I'm going to cover it up. And make sure it's extremely tight so that no air can come out. That's extremely important because we're steaming the rice now. That's partially why we added in the broth in there as well. And I'm going to set this aside now, and I'll show you how I'm going to do the family style one. It's exactly the same as this, but just a bigger version. Alright, so once everything is fully complete, They're all ready to go, covered up, seasoned perfectly. We're gonna toss them in the oven to bake for at least 1 hour at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And once it's ready, I will show you how to unmold them. Alright, so the rice has been cooking for about an hour. It is fully cooked. And you want to make sure that your rice is fully cooked. Just have a taste at the very top here and make sure that it's cooked. If it's still a little bit crunchy, that means it's not ready. But this one here is fully cooked. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to flip it over. It's a little bit hot, so make sure you have some gloves or something like that to protect yourself. And then I have a tray here with some aluminum foil, and you have to be extremely careful because it is hot. So I typically like to wear 2 gloves. Bring it to the edge, make sure you don't drop it, and then finally just flip it over. Now you don't want to remove it from the mold right away. You're going to let the steam do its thing because it's still hot, right? And eventually it will disconnect from all 4 corners and the whole thing will separate. So I'm just going to give it a couple minutes, and once it's ready, I'll show you what it's like once it's fully removed from the mold. So now I'm just going to remove this. Just be careful, it's extremely hot. And there you have it. Molded rice, tahchin. And right now, if you were to serve it, I would slice it up into, say, even squares or even rectangles, and you can serve it along with the extra broth that we made. But I'm going to plate the individual ones, and we'll go from there. Now this dish here is a main dish all on its own. If you're serving it for friends and family, I wouldn't suggest doing individual portions. Of course, these individual portions are meant more for restaurant kind of setting. And so if you wanted to make the family size one like I showed you previously, that's probably the better route to go. In Iran, typically this is not served as just a dish all on its own. They might make a smaller individualized portion so that way they can serve it with other side dishes or meats as well. Typically you can serve this with mint yogurts or any kinds of kebabs, barbecues, or something that we call torshi, which is pretty much just a sour pickle, depending on what kind of vegetable you like to use or what kind that's made for you. That's typically what's served with these kind of dishes to help cut down the richness a little bit. But if you want to eat this all on its own, it's more than delicious and very, very filling as well. So I'm gonna stop talking and I'm gonna stuff my face. Cheers. As I mentioned earlier, this dish is one of my all-time favorites because there's so many different flavors that are infused into this rice that you would never expect. And this kind of dish here is very modernized kind of interpretation of Iranian cuisine. Typically we serve basmati rice on the side with these barberries kind of infused in there and the chicken separate from it. But as of late, a lot of Iranians or a lot of Persians are coming up with new and innovative ways to kind of introduce Persian cuisine to the world, and this is a fantastic way to do it. So definitely have a try and let me know how it is. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, let me know. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel. Have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing everybody next time.